Welcome back to Gamecool Books. In our investigation of The Subtle Knife by Philip Pullman, we're joined this time by Guillermo Lariguet, a scholar and researcher at the University of the Littoral in Argentina. He's the vice director of their Center of Investigations on Legal and Social Matters at the National University of Cordoba, and an associate professor in ethics and the study of philosophy. Those are my loose translations from his bio on academia, which is where I found this paper. Again, it's in Spanish, but translated would be a brief philosophical examination of the trilogy of Philip Pullman, his Dark Materials. And the word literary appears there as well, the Literary Trilogy. And that's the main topic of this conversation, which was conducted in the form of transmissions that Guillermo was kind enough to send me via the messenger WhatsApp, I think over the summer. And so it's been quite some time since I've gotten these. I'm only just now finally getting around to putting them together and sharing them on the podcast here. I'll allow him to deliver his remarks, and I'll interpose some comments of my own from time to time. Thanks again to Guillermo, and I hope you enjoy.
Hi, Wesley. It is a very honor for me and a genuine pleasure to have the opportunity to talk about the general topic dubbed the relation between literature and moral philosophy. In the last years, I did research about precisely of the nature of this relation between literature and moral philosophy. There are many theses about the status of this relation. My interests was about, in principle, about to have the chance to answer the question about if literature can help moral philosophy in a specific sense. In order to answer this question, my philosophical hypothesis was, in principle, literature can be understood as an experimental thought that provide us with many examples of moral topics that moral philosophers were interested into to do research. For instance, moral literature or literature in general can provide examples about moral dilemmas or moral conflicts, the role or the presence of moral emotions, the presence of moral perception of the practical cases that moral agents afford, and so on. For example, if you take at the first line the novels of Henry James, for example, you can see the huge presence of moral conflict of the characters and the role of more emotions like compassion or like hate or the way in the some character hates another. Um, emotions like love, romantic love or pacific love, the role of compassion, the role of anguish, in the sense of Kierkegaard, and many moral emotions are the typical topics that we can identify in literature. These more emotions or the presence of moral perception in the sense, in the Aristotelian sense, for example, in the novels by Henry James or another class of writers, is a fantastic opportunity to select some experimental thoughts that literature can provide us. First of all, I am so sorry by my answers, but my natural and ordinary way to think about philosophy is mostly in Spanish. But I try to do some effort in order to answer in English. If we sum up the before answer, we can conclude that literature can provide us experimental thoughts and, of course, topics in order to reflect in a philosophical way. In literature, we can find many moral problems like moral responsibility, like in Sartre writings, more emotions like in Henry James writing, for example, the problems of moral emotions and the moral conflict in the Princess Casamazima. Of course, in addition, we can find fantastic approaches to moral problems, like in Haruki Murakami, for example, in his work Beyond Good and Evil, in where we can encounter characters that are surrounded by fantastic phenomena, and the philosophical questions could be in what sense these fantastical phenomena exert some influence in order to think moral responsibility, and so on.
So in these introductory remarks, we hear about literature as an experimental material, or as an experiment, in some sense, for philosophy to work upon. Examples such as Henry James and his work Princess Casamazima, I'm not familiar with it, and Sartre and Haruki Murakami, again, great authors of various times and places, ones I would never have thought to connect with Philip Pullman's work. I think the spectrum that is sketched out here between philosophy and literature is a somewhat fluid one. Two of the authors mentioned, Henry James and Kierkegaard, seem to me to occupy some sort of a middle ground, or at any rate the threshold between, on the one hand, literature, and on the other, philosophy. And the way that these experiments get worked out and thought about seem to cross back and forth between those two realms. It's an incredibly complex matter to establish when an author is doing philosophy and when an author is doing literature. But I think that this framework of reflection from one to the other might be a useful one to draw upon as we're trying to research and share what we find in these stories and in these investigations.
There is another sense in which literature could be an important insight or input in the conceptual analysis of moral philosophy. I think now in the topic of moral imagination, in the analogous sense of, or in the similar sense of Martha Nussbaum or William Boyd White and other thinkers or philosophers, since of the works of Immanuel Kant, the philosophers value very much the importance and the nature and the problems caused or placed by moral imagination, and the literature is the good example of moral imagination. Think, for instance, in Ian McEwan and his novel about the moral conflicts in this work. I'm thinking now in the Children Act. This is the case of witness of Jehovah that must to resolve the moral dilemma if in what sense the judge can interfere in the conception of life of the character of the main character of this the type of religion. Then moral philosophers we can improve their moral imagination in order to try to answer moral difficult questions. If you pay attention to the critical of judgment in the philosophical work by Immanuel Kant, we could identify the role of moral imagination, that is to make present some things that are absent in some time. But if we indeed we can try to get another insights of literature, we realized that there is another important philosophical problem around literature, that is the play of moral truth. If literature, the accurate way to get some moral truth, in what sense we can understand the nature of moral truth. What is moral truth? And so on. And in addition, we could try to find another important problems for moral philosophy that we can extract from literature. One of these problems is about, for example, if literature can help us in order to educate our moral emotions. Is it possible to educate moral emotions, or moral emotions are simply natural dispositions, or moral emotions are in addition cultural or normative dispositions, like, for example, virtues in the Aristotelian theory of ethics? If we remember the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle holds that virtues are special educated dispositions that permit to moral agents to resolve moral dilemmas. For example, and the most important case is the phronesis, or the prudence in the Latin sense. And if we come back to, for example, the literature written by Henry James, we effectively identify the presence of virtues, vices, and moral perceptions that are star topics in the Nicomachean Ethics.
So then we come to one main topic of moral imagination. I guess it's worked out primarily by Martha Nussbaum, a recent, even contemporary philosopher. I have to say I'm not familiar with much of recent philosophy, and, well, not with a lot of old philosophy either, since we hear about Kant and his critique of judgment. That's another one I haven't read, although I have heard of it. Obviously would be fundamental to a study of a question such as is presented in Ian McEwan's novel The Children Act, where there's a kind of judge interfering in the characters' problems. I'm not familiar with that novel, so I have a hard time speaking to that example. But the general idea here of trying to gain insight into moral truths by use of the imagination, by entering in sort of with compassion and with the emotions that we see portrayed in the stories, seems true to me, seems right. And I think to the question whether literature can help in developing moral emotions, moral imagination, that also seems like it must be the case, at least insofar as it would develop for us a shared stock of examples to draw upon, of stories that we're familiar with, and ways of talking about these kinds of problems when they come up in reality as well. The question of whether these to have a natural, a cultural, a normative component, again, there seems to be a kind of spectrum there, fixing the exact limits of which would be difficult, if not impossible. But certainly there has to be some aspect of shared experience, which we might as well call natural, and some aspect of what's learned and what's enculturated, which would come in the cultural or normative side of things. The work of Ethics by Aristotle is one I have read a few times and can highly recommend to anyone interested in finding a way into these topics. He provides the example of prudence being important in the work of Henry James. Again, I haven't read enough of Henry James. I can't come back with an example there, but certainly a little remarked upon virtue anymore. Prudence has a kind of old-fashioned sound to it, though the thing itself is no less important than it was in Aristotle's or Henry James's time.
At the last, the other philosophical question about literature, if its literature must and can replace philosophy, and concretely moral philosophy. For example, this is the thesis that Richard Rorty maintains in his work Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity, in where he sustains that literature has the most important skills that allow us to talk with another persons, and to empathize, and to have compassion, and to understand in the emotional way the importance, for example, of moral rights or human rights. And this thesis is a strong thesis because defends the possibility and the need to replace totally philosophy and the philosophical discourse and the philosophical argumentation and the logical relations and the conceptual analysis by the skills and the elements of literature. But I think that this thesis is very strong and doesn't capture our philosophical intuitions about the properly nature of philosophy. Philosophy, in my opinion, is a discourse, some class of discourse, some type of conceptual analysis that in which the importance is the importance of our task or tasks as philosophers is to argue in a properly manner in order to give good reasons for accepting thesis, conceptual thesis or normative thesis, and this exercise of the thought cannot be replaced by literature. At the contrary, literature can exert another type of help that that, as I sustained, is about the provide with experimental thoughts to give some insights about moral truth or some moral truth in order to can develop our moral imagination and so on. But the literature cannot and must not replace philosophy in the sense understood before. For example, one of my works, some works of mine, like my paper about the trilogy by Philip Pullman, The Golden Compass, is a good opportunity that I tried to show, the good opportunity to think about, for example, the problem, the classical problem, around the relation, the relation between religion and public sphere. This is the classical problem, for example, for moral or political liberalism, but it's the problem with a long story, a long history in the philosophy, because if we come back to the works of Locke, to the works of Baudin, Spinoza, Montaigne, etc., and so on, we can identify that the problem about the relationship between religion and public sphere is the problem about if religion, in a legitimate way, in a genuine way, can interfere with the arguments that we must offer in a public arena or in a political arena. This is one of the most important problems that lies, in my opinion, in the trilogy of Pullman, The Golden Compass, because is a fiction about the Christian Church that interferes constantly or frequently in the public or the political life. So, in this sense, the work of Pullman, the writer Pullman, Philip Pullman, is digamos, a fantastic opportunity to reflect about the relation between religion and political arena. And my thesis in this mentioned paper was a liberal thesis, very similar or very close to Martha Nussbaum's work, The Political Emotions. I refer to Political Emotions, in which sense that a political arena must be set apart of substantive religious arguments. This is, of course, a complex discussion. We can remember now the discussion between John Rawls and his political liberalism and the most complex interpretation by Jürgen Habermas, in the sense that the liberals must allow some place for religious arguments, because if we don't this, we can experiment some moral loss, because possibly the moral or the religious arguments can capture some moral truth, and this moral truth must be introduced by the way of these arguments. But the problem with religion in the liberal perspective is a problem, after all, of tolerance and the importance of tolerance in societies that are divided by plural and conflicted and eventually incommensurable conceptions of life, of good life. So the work of Philip Pullman, Golden Compass, is a good experimental thought that permit to think about this topic. Okay, many thanks for your attention, and I'm so sorry again for my English version of the answers.
Now, I think the topic of literature and philosophy is illuminated pretty nicely in the paper on Philip Pullman that led me to get in touch with Guillermo in the first place. He takes pains to sort of provide a reading of the trilogy with respect to philosophy of law and politics, as well as some commentary upon the metaphor of the dark material or dust that's at the heart of the story. The way that can be read as analogous to the person of God in the Christian religion, and the ways in which that person and that religion are critiqued in Pullman's work, and perhaps can lead us to try to find some new understanding of their place in society as well. The names Rorty and Rawls mean less to me than Locke and Spinoza and Montaigne do. Again, I've heard of them, but can't say that I've read their work. I do like the idea that an important theme in Pullman is the role of religion in the public sphere. It's really not the approach that I've taken to reading the work, which I've tried to focus more on the development of individual characters and not looked as much at the society or the politics that are at play. I think there's some evidence that those things are actually treated more as sort of ornaments rather than central elements of the story. Thinking of the political machinations of Mrs. Coulter and Lord Boreal, which are largely in the background in the book, since we're seeing things from Lyra's perspective. But I think that, yes, with hindsight and with a more adult perspective reading, you can see a lot of the importance of politics and religion in that sort of social side of things. There is a point at which I think we would definitely agree, which is that these stories are aimed at promoting tolerance and morals in some general sense, that there might be something that's lost when religious arguments are not given a place in public discourse, and that the role of fiction and seeking moral truth is a very important way in which religious discourse does still have a place in modern contemporary society and discussions. So I find that to be a incredibly stimulating and unexpected approach to Pullman. I've only just begun to read work by scholars working outside of the English-speaking world, and so I really appreciate and am grateful for Guillermo taking the time to reply to my questions and send me his thoughts. I hope that if you're interested, you'll seek out this paper. I'll post a link to it, and I can offer further rough translations if anyone is interested. Of course, I'll have to get Guillermo's permission before I do any large-scale translation of this work, but I hope that it finds a more of an audience, and I hope that it inspires people to go and read in some of this philosophical and literary material that forms the context for Pullman's story. So again, thanks to Guillermo. I have not been able to answer in Spanish much as I might have liked to, but I will again send you the link to that essay if you are interested in taking a look. Thanks for listening. Take care.